Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, host and executive producer of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Randall Baier. We're going to go through some of the new books that Rip Rap has received for review. Welcome to Rip Rap.
Thanks. I'm glad to be back again.
The first book is Lessons in Disaster, McGeorge Bundy and the Path to War in Vietnam by Gordon Goldstein. And I thought this was a pretty interesting book because certainly this country right now under President Barack Obama
Mm-hmm.
has had more than his share of disasters. But what was kind of a moral lesson out of this is that in this book, um, Goldstein notes that McBundy said, I had a great part in a great failure. And the failure was the war in Vietnam, that he had orchestrated the whole bureaucracy to handle.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking, and McGeorge Bundy was one of the best and brightest under the Kennedy regime and went on to the Johnson administration. So it kind of set me back because I was thinking, it doesn't matter how intelligent you are, you can still make stupid mistakes and ones that you regret. And Bundy was the principal architect of the Vietnam strategy, and he had never talked about his role in it until this book came out. And so I thought it was interesting because Bundy died in 1996.
Mm-hmm.
And so this kind of retrospective, but he did collaborate with Goldstein on trying to understand and going through the archive and, talk about the themes of presidential leadership and domestic politics, military strategy. And this is also tremendously relevant because the country right now is still involved in war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they're talking about Pakistan or something like that. So it's just one of these dilemmas or conundrums that we get ourselves into. And I thought it was really helpful, and it's a pretty well done book, really.
So this is a book that's come out 13 years after Bundy's death.
Yeah,
Was Goldstein working with him,
yeah.
interviewing him for a long period of time before he passed away?
Yeah,
And then archives, as you say.
And Goldstein is a scholar of international affairs who served as international security advisor to the Strategic Planning Unit of the Executive Office of the United Nations Secretary General. So, and he's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations now.
I wonder what was going on to prepare this book, why it took this long
Well, see,
to
Bundy
come
kept
out.
his silence. He didn't want
Yeah,
to. He
that's
didn't
true.
want
He
to
was
deal. When you're involved with it, and then there was such an animus, there was such antagonism about what had happened.
We've got a distance now, maybe.
Yeah.
Because I know Robert McNamara said a very similar thing when he wrote his memoirs and did the Fog of War. The Fog of War video was done about him, and he clearly felt. I think he felt remorse. At least he seemed to. Although I think maybe a lot of people weren't willing to forgive him for orchestrating the war in the way he did. But he admitted to making it a fiasco as well.
What's
Probably in a little
interesting-
more elegant terms that I just put, but
Goldstein also noted that had Kennedy lived and been reelected, he probably would have rethought the whole Vietnam strategy from
Yeah.
from what their previous conversations had been, and that he said, and Goldstein says, maybe this is the most important lesson we can derive from a great disaster. That I think he's saying that we need to rethink these commitments, particularly when they're so violent and so deadly,
Yeah.
and so time and resource consuming.
and change a
Yeah.
continent and a history. They can change a history.
But what's interesting, the final sentence is, as Bundy's final reflections on Vietnam illuminate, intervention is a presidential choice, not an inevitability.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's one characteristic. These presidents get into these wars and they feel they have to do them. They can't back up. So,
It's curious. I wonder if in 15 years the people who have orchestrated the war in Iraq will come out with similar confessionals. It's a cynic would say, well, it's a little bit late, but in terms of just reflection, people get older, they think back and really look seriously at what they do or did. I don't know. It's hard for me to imagine that some of the people that orchestrated our involvement in Iraq will feel like they made a mistake.
Well, of course, one of the big things right now is the issue of war crimes and prosecution for torture, or as they say, what,
Enhanced interrogation.
interrogation techniques.
Right.
And one authority that I've heard over and over again from, I think it's George Washington University, says that Barack Obama has no choice. That either he prosecutes, or sets up a special prosecutor, or the United Nations will, or someone else in the world will. Spain is doing it now. And if you don't prosecute those who committed it, then you become accessory to the crime.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's, and there's a lot of hoopla going on about that right now. So I think that's also kind of a lesson that if you do get fixated on making war, you have to stay within the boundaries and to keep reflecting on, like Goldstein says, that those choices are, that's a choice, not inevitability. You have to keep reflecting on it. You've got a book there on enchantment.
Well, this looks interesting. I'm intrigued that you picked this out. A Re-Enchanted World, The Quest for a New Kinship with Nature, James William Gibson, published by Metropolitan Books. I read through briefly just a few, caught a few. I think what he's trying to look at is what he calls the new kinship with nature. There is a renewal. I don't know if it's going back to nature in the same way that movement happened in the 60s. I think the renewal comes from a more spiritual kind of engagement, what he calls full enchantment with the natural world in terms of cultural models. And I know he mentions, he takes up some pretty controversial environmental issues in this book, one of them whaling, for instance. And in fact says an interesting thing. He says that the people who are against whaling and several of the Native American tribes, such as the Makah in northwest west of Seattle on the Olympic Peninsula, they have permission to whale because it's a ritual, a long-standing practice in their community. But both groups have a kind of sacred, what do you call it, contract with this issue of whaling. And he contrasts that to the way Iceland or Japan is whaling in a more mechanical, almost like a factory type of approach. It's what it is. You're right.
Have you seen those ships?
Yes,
They're
yeah,
huge.
and they are, and they're decimating the whale populations, smaller and smaller whales. Whereas, and it does get back. It's curious because in a ritual way, if you look at the way a whale is captured in a village kind of context. Of course, the villages are larger, but even today, boats of 10, 11 men go out to capture a whale, to kill a whale. It's a much different engagement than a factory ship with cannons. Although I'm not sure if some of the tribal members may be using mechanized harpoons or whatever. I'm not sure how they're actually killing the whale.
But they're certainly not as mammoth of a
Right,
scale.
right. So, but that's just a small. The details. The difference is that he calls that full enchantment with nature, full engagement with the sort of ritual cycle, whereas in terms of whaling, it's in touch. It's capturing, killing a natural product for human consumption. There's an attachment there, but it's incomplete enchantment with nature. It's not absolutely necessary for that society, in a sense, to thrive. And the opponents, I guess, in terms of whaling, try to make that argument to the Makah as well. They say, okay, to the tribal leaders, well, maybe you could take a break for a while, or maybe we could come to a different understanding. But both sides are engaged with the natural in a much more complete way. And he draws upon some interesting things from anthropology. Durkheim, totems, kin, belief in a kin, totemic animals, where in some groups would actually have a prohibition about hunting their totemic animal. It's interesting. It goes into a lot of ideas of spirituality and that.
I think for enchantment to occur, you need an overall framework of belief or engagement with the world, because that's what gives it that additional quality. And the depletion of our fishing resources hasn't come from people who are engaged that way. It's come from the factory. It's come from these huge enterprises.
Yes.
That they also have these long, 5-mile long nets, and they scoop up everything, including dolphins.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, that's what's depleting the
It's
fishing
mechanical,
resources.
indiscriminate.
But the ones that have an overall view of life, like Native American and other Native peoples, they only take what they need. And like I've read about Danish whaling communities, every piece of the whale is used. The blubber, everything is used, the meat and the flesh and everything. So it's not like they go out and get a whole bunch of whales, bring them back, take a little tidbit off one and let the rest rot.
Yeah.
And that's the difference. And I think that if you're living with this integration into with the natural world, respecting it, that's the difference. And I think there is a need, though, that people can't live with this industrialized model or paradigm, that it's depleting everything, what they live with, but also depleting their resources, how they conceptualize themselves and the environment that they live in. And so I think that's what I thought it was also kind of
right, what you were
interesting.
taking on this.
Because it also gets into magic. Magic is, again, an engagement with the environment, and knowing that there could be other ways of doing it rather than just the real literal, realistic,
Yes.
or actualistic kind of prospect.
Well, I think traditionally magic is as much a process of clarification as it is, tricks, bells and whistles and things of that method. It's more of an engagement with, say, the belief that there's another world behind, the visible world, that kind of thing. So that's our quest, I guess, to rediscover that.
And actually, the next book, California Indians and Their Environment, kind of leads from that. This is a major new introduction in terms of how California Indians interact. By the way, this is California Indians and Their Environment by Ken G. Lightfoot and Otis Parrish. But what they're looking at is how the California Indians interacted with the state's very landscape, enhanced its already bountiful natural resources through various practices centered around prescribed burning. Knowing the California fires, that's something else.
Wow.
But it also has some wonderful resources in terms of detailing the specific natural resource they dealt with, including fish like the Chinook salmon, coho salmon, candlefish, the lamprey, marine, and the plants. So it's quite encyclopedic that way. But I found what was interesting is that people who live very, very close to the land know the parts, all the elements, very intimately. And so they talk about the impact on, for example, about managing the landscape. They're very, very concerned about the ecological impact of what they're doing. They're not removed from it. They're just not driving through it. And so all these details, it's really quite detailed.
This book is about modern day, or does it trace a historical? It's looking at the ethnographic present, so to speak, plus recent engagement between the California Native Americans and modern life in California.
There's a little story in here by one of the authors. He said he was standing in front of the California Indian Gallery on the Berkeley campus of the University of Colorado, and there was a bunch of undergraduate students there on a tour. And one of the students lags behind and says, she says, I love all this great old stuff, but what can you really learn by studying them? And then she
Oh, she actually said that.
she actually said that. And
What
then
can
she
you learn by
adjusted the
studying?
earpiece and volume of her razor-thin iPod before continuing. And what relevancy does studying Indians have for our lives in California today? And, I mean, this stuff is really ancient history. That really encapsulates this whole
Mm.
issue. And this author says, before I can find my voice to defend my lifetime efforts of studying this old stuff, she has turned her attention to her cell phone, on which she's retrieving a slew of text messages. He says it's going to be another long day on the Berkeley campus. But that encapsulates all that.
Yeah.
Why look at the old
Why
stuff?
look at it, right? What's it gonna mean to you and carry on? How will it carry on through your life?
Well, one of my favorite authors was Marcel Eliade, even though some people, the myth of the eternal return.
Mm-hmm.
And, he talked about the cultures that are linear, like the Western culture. Everything is going always toward the new. So why would you study the old stuff? The old cultures are the cyclic ones, where they have the myth of eternal return. You get some new knowledge and then you reintegrate.
Bring it back, yeah.
And so in that little anecdote, I think is almost worth the book, because it encapsulates this. Why study the old stuff? Because when you reintegrate it into what you already know, now you know more and understand more what's going on.
Gives you a viewpoint to apply to what's going on in your life now.
And there's some wonderful...
It's interesting about the water rights as well.
Yeah.
The water rights and the burning.
So this is just, chock full of all this stuff of working with the natural world, the spatial organization, managed regional landscapes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a lot of stuff that we need to think about that the Native Americans did anyway.
Yes, yeah.
And that we need to learn back to that.
And modern day California has really supplanted, taken over.
But I thought it was interesting that the spark for it came from how they managed their landscapes in terms of prescribed burning. And this is at a time when there's huge fires. In fact, there's one going on now.
Yeah, in Santa Barbara. That's, I know one of my colleagues has her elderly aunt and her grandmother, granduncle and grandmother. They're late 80s, 90s, and frail. Have to be moved out and this and that. But it's ironic because, in a sense, a natural process that might have been controlled, in the past, is now become this. It's still a natural process in some way. I don't think this one was set. This was an accidental fire in Santa. I mean, lightning or some kind of thing. I don't think this one was an arson thing. But now you've got civilization. You've got homes and. There are no natural, the windbreaks have been broken and things of that nature, so it's now difficult to...
When you have the constant encroachment, just like in Michigan, you have people living more and more in the wetland areas where there's natural flooding. So then they're amazed that there's flooding
Hey,
going
guess
on.
what?
Like, hey,
Yes,
we
okay.
got another one there.
Well, yeah, this is another one. This one, speaking of the first book, or thinking about the first book, this one is Under Fire, Childhood, in the Shadow of War, edited by Elizabeth Goodenough and Andrea Immel. This is, I'm taking a look because it looks like it's about young people involved living under war, through war. A series of essays. Our picture is of some German kids in 1939. Having to go through tear gas training and gas training, mask training, published by Wayne State University.
And she's, Linda Goodenough teaches at the University of Michigan.
At the University of Michigan, okay. So there are titles in here, Illustrated Wartime Propaganda for Children. Surely there is no British boy or girl who has not heard of the Battle of Waterloo. War and Children's Literature in the Age of Napoleon, Germans and Post-War British Children's Fiction, and some other essays, Remembering the Holocaust in Children's Literature, The Anxiety of Trauma in War Fiction. So it's a study of letters, really. I mean, not written letters, but of, letters, humanities letters, the written word. a physician's take on Ferdinand, which I wonder if this is on Ferdinand the bull who refuses to fight and sits down in the flowers, and a book which I, as a child, it was like the top book on my shelf. I think maybe that's why I became a pacifist. But this is richly illustrated with signs of the scenes and postcards, for instance, of the time, the image of the Waterloo-era soldier, children's calls to arms from the Nazi period, and during the Italian and German fascism, and other scenes of illustration that have to do with war. And you know, I think the Ferdinand the Bull and also George Bernard Shaw, Arms and the Man, or what they call the chocolate soldier, this soldier who's so cynical he doesn't have bullets anymore. He just carries chocolate because he just wants to, you know, survive. But this reminds me of another book that was put out several years ago in German language, but they chose German language as as kind of the mother tongue of the book, because it was by a lot of all European women who had lived through World War II as children. So they're now 65 or older. Called with what do you call it? Comfort, handbag and a teddy bear, and it's women from Poland, from Holland, from France, Switzerland, even Italy, Spain, and Germany, and their stories as children, what they had to go through, you know, evading war or moving around Europe, the whole area of Europe. So it's definitely a topic 65 years after the war, 60 years.
I think it's very useful to keep thinking about the impact of war on everybody,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the most unrecognized populations are children, because the combatants are adults usually, unless you have boy soldiers somewhere.
Right.
But what they're also talking about is the impact on the interior imaginative life, and that's even deeper and lasts the rest of their lives. What they went through in terms of being moved around, what they saw, what they read, what they heard, and you know, it has a tremendous impact. If you were on a train, you know, going to a concentration camp, you're not ever going to forget that.
Yeah, certainly.
If you were, you know, like in England, when they shipped the kids to the
countryside,
rural,
to live with the aunts and uncles or whatever. Yeah.
They never forgot that.
Very true. Yeah.
The Young Charles Darwin by Keith Thompson. Of course, this is the big anniversary of Darwin.
Yes.
What was interesting, and that's what Keith Thompson talks about, he's a professor emeritus of natural history at the University of Oxford, is talking about, well, what was Darwin like earlier, you know, when he was coming up through. And so he looks at his Darwin's early life as a schoolboy, as a medical student at Edinburgh, a theology student at Cambridge. I didn't quite realize that.
That's fascinating.
And as the naturalist aboard the Beagle on his famous 5-year voyage. And so we don't normally do biographies, but this is pretty interesting, because he said that he was vastly erudite, powerful, ambitious, but also self-absorbed and lacked self-confidence. See, isn't that interesting?
It is interesting that he would end up, you know, writing what he did. Well, I suppose he could still have doubts about it, I imagine. I mean, maybe
the other thing was they said he was hampered as much by family and sustained by a passion for philosophy and logic. And this is a guy who had been a theology student.
I wish the intelligent design people, to quote, you know, the elder George Herbert Walker Bush, when he made his comment about the spotted owl crowd. So, okay, we've got the intelligent design crowd. I wish they would acknowledge this aspect and you know, deal with this in some way. Although I have to confess, I don't spend a lot of time interacting with intelligent design theorists. You know, so I'm not that
A
engaged in the
question
argument.
that Thompson raises, how did a quiet, shy 27-year-old with no apparent credentials as intellectual, who had moreover been isolated for 5 years on a small ship, the Beagle, on a voyage around the world, develop the most dangerous idea of the past 200 years?
Dangerous idea, yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
from this rather modest guy,
Right.
as he came up with this. And he said that the concept of natural selection did not come to Darwin one day in the bath.
Shall I do this book?
I thought that it was instructive for us at this point in our country's history because he's studying the Raikas. It's a little-known group of migrant shepherds in western India.
Well, it's amazing to realize that there are markets among migrant peoples.
But there's some interesting concepts went by. One of them was a placeless community. No nomads have a community, but it's always a community no matter where it is.
Right, moving, mobility, yeah.
The other thing was that this big debate about studying marginalized people and the concept of the noble savage. And what's interesting, he takes as a place in between. In other words, he's not making them more noble or more wonderful, but they're also not mundane. That they did bring value to understanding. The other thing was the leadership, and that's why I felt was relevant. They didn't really select leaders. They selected, I guess, what they call it. They served as agents.
Persuasive.
The people who kind of led their group, but they kept very close track of how this person was doing it. And at certain points, if the person didn't function well, they would send them home or send them away in mid-migration.
Yes, right. Take your goats and move
which
along.
Was dangerous,
right, sure.
Because they had to cross all that other stuff.
Right, because it's a seasonal migration pattern, I imagine.
Right. And
rains
so
and whatnot.
That was the worst thing that could happen because it also you would have great loss of face and everything else. But I like this idea that there was this very close relationship between leader and the people being led, and that the people being led did not sign off.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's relevant to this country with Barack Obama and George Bush before. With Bush, they had signed off.
They had.
Until the election happened, and then they pulled the plug on him. So this whole thing of green your pastures, I thought was pretty interesting because we're always looking for a better place, you know, and maybe we'll find it, but we have to have the leaders who are helping us work toward that moment.
Yeah.
But I think, well, I think we got another program done this time.
It's great.
And the other, excuse me, thing he said, the other thing he said was the core of Darwin's idea is elegant in its simplicity and daunting in its range of consequences.
Mhm.
I mean, when you really do get a theoretical concept that really has some legs to it, but he said been prepared for the subject by studies at Edinburgh and Cambridge universities.
Mhm.
And he developed much of the necessary empirical data and honed his analytical skills while on the Beagle. But it, you know, do you remember the rest of the title of the book?
No.
See, this I asked
All
my
I
students
remember,
is
and I don't think it's
Origin
even
of
literally
Species.
the it's not literally the voyage of the Beagle, is it? Isn't
No,
it?
no,
Isn't
no.
it some
But I asked this to my students because they never remember the rest.
the
of
origin of the
it.
species?
It's on the origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life.
Whoa.
That's
Yes.
a big kicker at the end.
Yes. Right. Wow.
And what's strange is that people don't know the rest of the title. You
Yeah.
only know about the origin of species.
Right. Yeah. Right. I can. It's amazing to think. You know, here he is, like in Shakespearean mode, pondering the amphibian or some bone. I mean,
Or
not to
the
make light on
skull,
it. It's
the head, yeah.
the skull. Yeah. It's remarkable in that his illustrations. I've seen some of the, you know, the actual biologist, naturalist work that he did. I mean, he really was a careful observer.
There's
And-
a little joke in here that is kind of interesting. He said Darwin's family was quite sparing in bestowing first names. For example, the famous Charles Robert Darwin had an uncle named Charles and had a grandfather, another uncle, and a brother all named Erasmus. So when he's writing this biography, it's hard to
know which Erasmus
which
he's
which
talking
Erasmus
about,
he's
right?
talking about, yeah.
That's interesting.
So I mean, there's these other things.
yeah.
So it was like the Russian system. You know, the Russians have your full
Mhm.
formal name, then you had a nickname. So that's what they had.
Yeah.
Charles
exactly.
was Bobby. Erasmus was Raz. Carolyn was Granny. Emma was Titty. I mean, you know, they had all these
Amazing.
nicknames for them.
I recall now that on an interview that I heard, or a presentation, National Public Radio, earlier in the year, in February of 2009 here, or March, did the series around the birthday, you know, commemoration of the 200th birthday. And they talked about his doubt, of his growing doubt in not the origin of the species, but the opposite, the fact that, you know, God created the heaven and the earth and all the critters within. And it talked about his religious doubt, his sort of challenge of faith. It was an interesting program. Probably in some ways, they had various writers on those radio shows, and perhaps one of these fellows was perhaps he was interviewed. But it did point out that he questioned himself quite a bit about what he was
And he mentions how Darwin
proposing.
really didn't like that ship, the Beagle.
Well, it was
But do you know how big it
tough.
was?
It was tiny, as I
It was
understand it.
96 feet long. And it was a converted brig, and it was called a surveying ship. Okay, but on board were 60 officers and sailors. Got 60 people on a 96-foot
yeah.
boat.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then he said on Monday he said he was thoroughly sick of the Beagle, hated the sea and everything about it, the cold, the damp, the smells, the close quarters, the mindless routines, and seasickness. So it's the
It was
more
rough.
human side of you
Yeah.
know what was gone through and all that.
Yeah.
But I thought
Yeah.
it's a pretty interesting. And then there's a chapter in here about living the lie. That you know, as he's dealing with this, he really had skeptical. You know, he was skeptical about what he was going through, because he realized he had to fully substantiate this theory, and if it wasn't substantiated, it was a lie.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so
Mhm.
I find. And then there's that thing also about finding this place. You know, as he became more famous, that brought with it another thing. And then it said, in the end, Darwin, like so many great men, has to be seen as a series of contradictions, not all of which we'll fully understand. He was variously a dashing, daring explorer, but also a recluse, a competitive, driven scholar, and a loving, gentle family man, a student of minutiae and grand theorist, a revolutionary and founder of unorthodoxy. And he tried to avoid controversy wherever possible.
He walked
and
right
he's
into
got
it.
the biggest thing
Yeah,
going on.
yeah. We actually have a new book. There is a new book that's been published in the art world about the impact of Darwin's theories and Darwinism, evolution, and whatnot, and the just the exoticism, the sheer exoticism of seeing this other world, all the specimens and the stories that the Beagle brought back. It's basically the impact of Darwin on art and the new types of art that have come out. And I'm sure that most universities have probably picked this up now. I know we have it at Eastern Michigan, and I'm sure it's at the art library at University of Michigan here in Ann Arbor. But it's quite interesting because it talks about the impact on artists of these studies, and also the social impact. A lot of paintings started to deal with social themes that comes out of Darwin's writing, or at least the impact of the paradigm shift, basically.
Well,
so
if this is true, well then what?
yeah. So what's this? Right.
Everything else
But also, I think maybe some of the ways humans were being portrayed, given your second part of your title, the hierarchies of the races or whatever.
Preservation of favored races.
Favored races, yeah, trouble. A
It's
real
very
Victorian
British,
theme.
very
Oh
British
yeah, I
and
mean this
very
is
colonial,
the whole
very
history of
imperial.
Victorian anthropology
Yeah.
comes from that.